My name is Blair Stonechild, and I'm making a presentation on Indigenous spirituality as a foundation for research. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out. And I was afraid that no one would show up, so when I told that to my wife this morning, she says, "Don't worry, I'll come in just so there's somebody there." And it doesn't get any better than that, right? Okay, my voice is a bit iffy too, so I hope that I hope everyone will be able to hear me okay. So my presentation, Indigenous Spirituality as a Foundation for Research, is something that I've always had a long interest in. One of the things at the First Nations University is that when I started there in 1976, I know that the priority was teaching things like treaties, history, preservation of rights, all that type of thing. And so at that time, we didn't really place a lot of emphasis on spirituality, and in fact, the elders were really not that, they weren't really even that willing to speak about spirituality back in those days. However, those times are changing, and so I've really been fortunate to be able to follow up this interest in working with the elders and finding out a lot of really interesting things, which I'm more than happy to share with you today. So let me just first of all talk about what do I mean by spirituality. Okay, so there's really two things that I'm talking about. One is I'm talking about spirituality in the sense that it gives us a sense of being something greater than we are. In other words, it gives us a greater sense of meaning, as human beings. The other aspect of spirituality that I'm talking about is something which is accessible, something which is accessible that goes beyond, let's say, like our five senses, what we normally detect as human beings. The idea that if there is something out there which is beyond, simply what we normally experience, is there a way to access information from that type of thing? And I know personally I took an interest in that because of ceremonies that I've been involved with, in which I found very interesting ability to access information that one would normally not think that they could access. Okay, so if you can click it here. So what I'm basically going to talk about is sort of two areas. One is what I call the Aboriginal Spirituality Project, and this is sort of like a larger framework of work that I'm doing in terms of research, in terms of interviewing elders, and in terms of writing up the results so that it can be used as curriculum. And the second one is a specific research project which I did back in 2012, which I completed back in 2012. It's called Reincarnation Beliefs Among the Plains, Cree, and Saulteaux. And so I'll talk in specific terms. I can talk about the type of work that I did with that specific research project, and later I can talk about sort of some of the broader research issues that I'm interested in. So in terms of this research project, as I mentioned, I was interested in. May as well take it to the next slide. So when I started to think about how can I get funds to begin doing research with elders, I had to come up with some kind of a fundable research project, and one of the places, of course, I was applying to was SSHRC. And so I had to come up with something that had a distinct methodology, and so what I did is I latched onto this idea of asking questions about reincarnation belief among First Nations of this area. And I had actually come across a book which is called Amerindian Rebirth by Dr. Antonia Mills, who was actually with the University of Northern British Columbia. And I noticed that in her book she covered most First Nations of North America, but she didn't include the local groups like the Plains Cree and the Soto. So I thought, well, that's something I can do. I can see whether or not those beliefs are also here, because I really hadn't heard elders talk very much about it, and I was curious to see whether or not those beliefs held true here as well. And that also would give me an opportunity to kind of delve into some of the more esoteric or some of the deeper meanings of spirituality, some of the deeper philosophy, to try and explain why it is that, for example, if the elders talked about reincarnation beliefs, what would the context of that be? And I was fortunate, I have actually been fortunate over the years to work with a number of very wonderful elders, but the one elder who I really connected with was Danny Musqua. He was actually called Dr. Danny Musqua because he actually got an honorary doctorate from the University of Saskatchewan. He's probably one of the most preeminent elders in Saskatchewan, and he's in particular very knowledgeable about what you might call the deeper teachings of spiritual philosophy. And it's also interesting that in order to begin to access some of this information, you have to go through a certain protocol. And I know that's something that even when I started working at the Saskatchewan Indian Federal College in 1976, that's something that I didn't really fully understand. There were elders here and there, and you could chat with them, and they would talk to you, and you could go to ceremonies, and you could participate in ceremonies. But I suppose for myself, I was too interested in just the day-to-day life, and at that time, I guess I really wasn't that serious about spirituality. And it was actually not until, I guess you might say, I had some, personal challenges and crises that I actually began to turn to the elders in a serious way. And in doing that, I used traditional protocol, which involves usually the presenting of tobacco. There can be cloths and other things, and going into ceremonies. And once I did that, I began to find that there was a whole universe of information there that they were willing to share with me that I, really hadn't been aware of. And it was really quite, to me, it was really quite astounding. And so this kind of information you usually don't get unless, you're going through the proper protocol. You sort of develop a personal relationship with the elder, and you go into ceremonies. And I guess they realized that I had a sincere interest in spirituality, and because I had been working at the university for so long, they knew that I was a serious scholar who was interested in exploring their knowledge system in a systematic way. And so they really have accepted me as what's called a knowledge keeper. In other words, they're giving me this knowledge, and they're asking me to write it up and share it. And it's also interesting that, I mentioned to you that back when the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, or First Nations University, first started in 1976, the elders weren't really that open about sharing. They really weren't too sure about it. But that attitude has really changed, and I found in my discussions with elders that all of a sudden now they're very, very interested in having this spiritual knowledge shared. And so hopefully I'll be able to impart a bit of that to you today. Okay, the next slide, if you would. Okay, so the elders and a lot of Aboriginal educators talk about holistic education and holistic lifestyle. So when you take a look at what holism means, generally it's broken into 4 quadrants. There's the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. And so, in effect, what really has been happening in most cases is that the physical, mental, and emotional are the areas that are generally covered or talked about in education, and I would say that also in many ways is the characteristic of the curriculum that we have in most schools, and even here at the university. I know that if you go to the Department of Philosophy or Department of Religious Studies, they'll talk about spirituality, but here when we talk about spirituality, we're talking about spirituality in a different sense. We're talking about spirituality as, I guess you might say, a lifestyle. It's something which is an integral part of everything. And the more I study the traditional lifestyle and the more that I listen to the elders, the more I realize that in pre-contact times, spirituality was really a very central part of the way they lived. Ceremonies were a central part of what they did, and the purpose of ceremonies was really to maintain a connection, a meaningful connection with what they perceived as being spiritual. And the elders told me that spirit is a real thing, that there really is a spirit world and that type of thing. So if we can just carry on to the next one here. Okay, so before I start talking about some of the observations and conclusions that I've been arriving at, let me first just say a little bit about research limitations. I myself am a residential school survivor. Oh, okay. And not only that, I also grew up off of the reserve. So I didn't really have an opportunity to grow up learning Aboriginal languages. And I found that learning an Aboriginal language is not as easy as you think. Interestingly enough, I have passable fluency in French. And I often say that when I was in residential school, I used to hear the priests and nuns. They kind of talk behind your back when they didn't want you to understand. They talk in French. I went to university at McGill, which is in Montreal. So I had a lot of exposure to French. You see French all over. It's written and all that type of thing. But when it comes to an Aboriginal language, I find that it's much trickier. You can't just have a dictionary. You need to have more than that. The actual language can become very tricky if you're not very familiar with it. So that's been a limitation of myself, for myself, which I've always been concerned of. But the elders were quite reassuring, and basically what they said, the issue of not being fluent in Aboriginal language is often seen as the barrier to conducting effective research. However, elders feel that while it is difficult to express their concepts in English because they're not the same terms, it is still possible to express basic ideas in English by using explanation and including key First Nations terms. So one elder, for example, in terms of talking about the spirituality of language, was explaining to me the meaning of the colors. And so, for example, if you take in Cree, if you take the word green, in Cree the word green literally means the color of plants. Okay, so, and to give you another example, the color red literally means the color of blood. So you can see right away the connection of those words to the natural or the environment, right? So for myself, right, I'm wearing the color of plants, right? That's kind of a, gives you an illustration of, first of all, the sort of like the difference in terms of the spirituality language, but it also shows that it is possible to express those ideas in English, but it takes more work. The other thing, of course, is that Aboriginal languages tend to be much more spiritual in nature. Like sort of like the origins. A lot of the ideas are based in spiritual ideas, whereas in English, it becomes very technical and very secular, and so the whole meaning sometimes is lost. Linguists will be needed to elucidate the subtleties of such spiritual terminology, and I know, speaking to some of the linguists at the college, even there, they, in many cases, there isn't a lot of familiarity with a lot of the spiritual terminology. So that's something which will take a lot of work to do. Anyway, the elders basically said, that type of work should not be something which prevents or delays work to research and attempt to describe and articulate these Indigenous spiritual concepts. Now, below is a quotation that Danny Musqua made when I was interviewing him. He says, writing as an idea that our brothers from foreign countries across, oh, it looks like I missed a letter there, should be countries, not counties, across the ocean brought with them. We have to use that knowledge system to capture our stories, the stories of our old people, before we lose them all. We have to encourage our young people, our writers, our university professors, our students, to help us capture back those knowledge systems one more time, so that we can pass on to the world the way of peace. Okay, so he basically told me, he says, a lot of the old elders are passing away. He says, the ones who have been brought up in a traditional lifestyle in traditional languages. And in fact, even in southern Saskatchewan, I know some of the elders today that do a lot of work went through residential school. And so, they don't have that much command of their own language. There's been tremendous language loss in southern Saskatchewan. And yet these people are working, and I know I interviewed many elders who spoke to me in English. And so Danny Musco is basically saying that, we need a new generation of elders and knowledge keepers, younger people who can not only have an understanding of their own culture, but also can use what he called the modern tools. For example, in my case, he was talking about tape recorders. And so, he really supports the idea that that this type of knowledge, needs to be articulated for the modern generation. And all elders I spoke to were particularly concerned about Aboriginal youth, and feel that one of the reasons why Aboriginal youth are straying into such such unfortunate territory as gangs and crime and that type of thing is because of a loss of connection to their own spirituality. Okay, I'll talk about that more later, but I'll just come back to the specific research project which I worked on. And so, I interviewed 13 elders. I approached them with traditional protocol, which is tobacco. As I found some elders are actually reluctant to speak about these type of matters outside of a ceremonial context. So you have some elders who are still very traditional in outlook, right? They won't share certain information unless it's very strictly done in certain contexts. Other elders I find are much more, I guess you might call it progressive, or willing to change, willing to change their approach and attitude as society itself changes. And I know Elder Danny Musco emphasized to me, he says, knowledge is part of the Creator. He says, learning is sacred. And most of the elders were more than happy to share a lot of the information that they had with me. Anyway, to summarize a little bit more of the results, I interviewed 13 elders, 10 male, 3 female. Of them, there were 5 who were Plains Cree. Of those, 3 confirmed that there was a concept of rebirth or reincarnation. 2 said that they were either uncertain or unwilling to discuss it. There were 5 Soto elders interviewed. 4 of them said yes, there is such a belief. 1 said perhaps. And then 3 others I interviewed. 1 was Dakota, 1 was Chickasaw, and 1 was Métis. And of those, 3 said yes, and none said no. So if you really take a close look at it, really none of the elders said no. None of them just plain out and said no, there's no such thing. And I also found it interesting as I began to do some background reading on reincarnation. It said that reincarnation beliefs were actually virtually universal at one time. Even in Christianity, for example, this is something which is not well known, that beliefs in reincarnation were actually quite accepted up until about, I think it was around 430 AD or something like that. There was some kind of a major gathering, as conference at Constantinople or something like that, in which I guess you might say the creed or whatever it is of reincarnation was kind of expunged from Catholic beliefs. because they felt that it could interfere with some other areas of the creed. And some of the elders talked a little bit more in depth about this term of reincarnation. For example, one disagreed with the term, stating that when there is rebirth, that it's not the same ego that is reborn, but rather there is some sort of a spiritual metamorphosis that takes place, and that attributes of ancestors can actually be drawn upon. So, these are interesting things, and actually, I'll talk a bit later. There's actually a great deal of research in areas like reincarnation going on, some of it at universities, some not, but it is something which I think is also of interest in terms of basic research. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, so first of all, I'll talk about sort of like the findings of spirituality in terms of the aspect of spirituality that affects who are we? Do we have a sense? Can we have a sense of larger meaning? And in my discussion with elders, and in terms of trying to understand the philosophical system, it became very clear that there is one central idea, and it's a fundamental idea without which you can't really understand what they're really talking about. And so I call it the great principle, and the great principle is that we are spirit beings on a physical journey. So to quote Elder Danny Musco, he says, the physical journey is what our spirit wants to take on. Our soul, and the Cree term is for its achak, goes to the center of our body to become its living force. Up to that point, the old people tell us that this spirit knew everything about the spiritual universe that it came from. It knew everything except the physical state. That's what it wanted to know. And he went on to very expansively talk about things like, for example, the process of birth. And just to kind of sum it up in a nutshell, he says, upon birth, the memory of spirit life is removed, as if placed under a veil. Our challenge is to learn from life and then to find our way back to spirit. And also, remarks that the physical world is temporary and transitory, but the spirit world lasts forever. And so when you think about the physical world, nothing is ever the same from one second to the next. Everything is changing. Even the matter around us is changing. And, they say that, for example, even in terms of our physical bodies, that every 10 years, like the matter in our body is completely renewed. So, so it gives you some food for thought. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Okay, so you take that fundamental principle, which is that we're really spirit beings on a physical journey. That takes us to the next thing, which is called the Great Law, and there has been some research on this. I know there's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, Native Studies, Rob Innes, who recently published a book called was a study that he did about relationships in the First Nations, Cowessess First Nations community. He in his title referred to the Great Law of the People. And so what is the Great Law? Well, basically, again, it stems from this premise that we are spirit beings who come into physical bodies in time and space. Now, what happens when that happens is that we pay a certain price for that, and that price is that we become basically individualized. We become individual entities. We perceive ourselves as individual egos, and so once that happens, that sets up what essentially is probably the greatest challenge for us as humans, and that challenge is basically to rediscover through experience and learning what the proper relationships with the natural world, other humans, and the spirit world should be, and to live them. And so, it's interesting because as I started thinking about this, when you think about something like, for example, the Ten Commandments, right? If you're And I was actually raised a Catholic. I went to went to residential school, so I certainly had the Ten Commandments drummed into me. The thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, so and so, thou shalt not steal, and it goes on, right? And when you really think about that, I mean, what are those? Those are really, rules of relationships, aren't they? That's so I mean, fundamentally, when you look at that, or for that matter, if you take a look at most other religious systems, they tend to have a list of things that you can and can't do. So, this is, in a similar way, the First Nations, Aboriginal people have their own sets of I guess you'd call them tools. I hesitate to call them rules because we don't have something which is like a set of 10 commandments, but we do have tools with which we can learn how to find out these proper relationships and to use them. Okay, so the elders talk a lot about the tools to learn this knowledge on earth is in the form of the 7 disciplines, and there is actually a book which is auto-published, which a student of Danny Musqua's published. It's called the 7 Fires, and the 7 Fires refers to the 7 stages of life, but in that Danny Musqua talked about the 7 disciplines, and I'll actually have them coming up here. Anyway, the last quote from Danny Musqua I found interesting. He says, the body has 1,000 wills, but the spirit has only one will, which is to find its way back to its real home, which of course is spirit. The only thing we have to help us is the body that we have. And the key is to be found within oneself. In other words, Danny Musqua and other elders talked about when we come into this physical world, there are many things which we're confronted with, things which are things that we have to learn. For example, we have families or we have occupations, those type of things. But they also talked about things which become distractions. And many of these things become distractions which essentially hinder us from our proper journey. And the elders would basically say, Danny Musqua would basically say, when you get into those kind of difficulties, it's because you haven't discovered the proper relationship. So, I often say, and one of the interesting things that one can say is that relationships actually speak back to you. Relationships are two-way things. So let's say if you don't have a good relationship, let's say with the natural world, eventually that natural world is going to talk back to you, like pollution, right, and all that kind of stuff, climate change. That's the environment talking back to you. If you don't have a proper relationship, let's say with your pet, right, you could end up getting bitten, right? And of course, family and human relationships. If you don't have a proper relationship with your wife, with your friends, they let you know, right? Or if you decide that you prefer to have criminality, things which are really things that are not appropriate relationships, well then, you end up being in the justice system or whatever. So the key is to discover what those proper relationships are. And so if we can go to the next slide. These are the 7 tools that Elder Musqua described to me as the tools which we need to use in terms of finding out what these proper relationships are. And so it's interesting that while we obviously have an outside world, right? We have an outside world which is accessible through our 5 senses. We can listen to people, we can talk to people, that type of thing. And in that way we learn something, right? And in large measure when we're going to school or university, this is outside learning. But the elders always impressed on me that there's also another way of learning. There's an alternate way of learning, which is a way of inner learning. And that you can actually access this learning. And the way you access it basically is through prayer, meditation, fasting. Those, for example, would be key ways, through ceremonies, through observation of your dreams through visions and those type of things. So these are also considered to be what you might call methods of research or learning on the part of the elders. Okay, I just put this little chart in here just for discussion information. It's got some extra wording there, which isn't really that important. The point here is simply to say that there are all of these various types of beings who are in the physical world. And the only reason I put this on is to point out that man is not at the center of, considered to be the center of creation. That is, as for example, in many cases in a lot of religions, like a lot of people say, if you take Christianity or Islam or Judaism, a lot of people describe those as man-centered religions. In other words, they kind of operate on the premise that man is the center of the purpose of life. This type of system basically believes that everything has its own spirit, everything has its own reason for being, everything has its own consciousness, and as we go through life, we interact with all of these things. And again, we need to discover proper relationships. Okay, so some people might say, so what? What's the purpose of all this? And of course, my presentation talks about Indigenous spirituality as a foundation for research. So I just put down some things here which are some apparent applications. There is actually something going on here at the University of Regina in the Department of Psychology, which is called transpersonal psychology. And what transpersonal psychology basically says is that in terms of dealing with psychological problems, that you start from the premise that there is some sort of a spiritual basis to life. Okay, so that's how you approach healing. There are other areas which I think are fairly well known. For example, counseling of Indigenous youth. There's corrections, use of ceremonies in prisons. So these are some things that we're familiar with. Now I also say that if this if you want to call it ideological system or paradigm is accepted about what the elders have to say, well then it also provides the potential to reevaluate the approach to many existing disciplines. For example, history, which is what I've done for a long time. And for example, if I knew more about this when I began to write my analyses of history, it would have been different. And so the same thing goes with things like philosophy, even biology. I know I was watching something on the other day on TV about the life of plants, right, and how they seem to have intelligence and all that type of thing. And so, the elders would say, well, they have their own consciousness, right? Okay, now the First Nations University of Canada does have an agreement with the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia to cooperate on matters of mutual research. So, this is, there are research opportunities which are available. And so I wanted to turn, next slide here, a bit more to the second aspect of spirituality I was talking about, which is this question of spirituality as something which you can kind of relate to, which is beyond, like your normal human experience, which is what you experience through your five senses, your waking consciousness and that type of thing. And so I know the elders, they maintain that there is essentially a whole universe out there which can be accessed. And this particular book, as I was teaching and researching, I came across this book, which I mentioned earlier, called Amerindian Rebirth, compiled by Antonia Mills, Amerindian Rebirth, Reincarnation Beliefs Among North American Indians and Inuit. And so this kind of got me thinking along the lines of doing research in reincarnation. Yeah, you can turn it, yeah. And it kind of opened up a whole new world of research for me because Antonia Mills, before she began working with the elders in the Northwest Coast, and of course the Northwest Coast is well known for its reincarnational beliefs. They often talk about individuals being the rebirth, reincarnation of an ancestor and that type of thing. And reincarnational beliefs are very openly talked about in Northwest First Nations culture. But the interesting thing about Antonia Mills is she received training in reincarnation studies from a place which has probably the best worldwide centers, the best worldwide center for reincarnation studies at a place called the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And so as part of my research, I was fortunate to go and spend some time down there and to see what they're doing. And I found it very interesting because they basically use an empirical method of research. And so I just kind of listed here some of the aspects of this research. Basically what they do is they focus on the spontaneous recollections of children who are under the age of 6 and who have memories of past life. So that's the primary approach. And of course, part of the premise is that young children would not have sort of any biases to wanting, to either remember these things, or they wouldn't have any sort of motivations to kind of deceive people or make up stories, that type of thing. And it's interesting that sometimes when children talk about this, they're often dismissed, right? Those notions are dismissed as somebody's imagination. But these children tend to be very passionate about it. They're very convinced that these things are real, and so and they often give very detailed descriptions about this previous life. And so in these type of cases, the researchers basically go out and they visit these families and the children. And there's actually, if you take a look at the internet, there's actually on the internet one of the research cases which you can follow through as it's being researched. If you Google Dr. Jim Tucker, who works with the University of Virginia, and it's called "The Boy Who Remembered a Previous Life." I think that's the title of it, and it'll come up on the internet, YouTube. And so what they do is they basically go and try and verify before the child has had an opportunity to try and connect with any of this alleged previous life. They actually go out and they'll go and check to see if they can find evidence of this previous life. For example, things like names of people that were claimed to have been remembered, or places that are claimed to have been remembered, and also things like, for example, method of death. And it's interesting that the majority of children who recall these previous, some like 2/3, have usually died violently in a previous life. The other thing which was done at the University of Virginia is that they also found that there's often a lot of things like birthmarks, which, as they researched it, I know they actually produced a 2,000-page volume of research on how, you can connect birthmarks with, with accounts of things that happened to these children in previous lives. Okay, next one. Okay. So when I went to the University of Virginia, they were actually delving into, and this Department of Perceptual Studies is part of the Department of Psychiatry at the School of Medicine at the University of Virginia. It's a very prestigious institution down there, and very well-known medical center. And so it was interesting that they're one of a very handful of universities that are actually seriously studying these type of things. And so the other area that they were involved in was near-death experience studies. And so what near-death experience studies are observations reported by individuals who have technically died. They've been in terms of whatever measures of death have been used, they were considered to be dead, or I guess terminal or whatever. And so what they found, and again, there's a lot of popular literature out there. You can find a lot that's been done, but there are more researchers, serious researchers, like for example, the people here at the University of Virginia, and also physicians who observe these things and who are attempting to do some serious research in it. So they're finding a high degree of consistency in the experience of these individuals, including things like encountering beings or deceased relatives, things like experiencing altered time and space, entering a tunnel, having an out-of-body experience, having a life review. And it's also interesting that in some cases, there are cases where individuals who have not had brain activity, and I believe that happens also in heart transplants, that they actually report consciousness, which suggests that consciousness can actually exist separately from brain activity. And also a lot of people who experience death have out-of-body experience, and there's a growing body of research there too. There's actually an institute which is near Charlottesville. It's about 30 miles from Charlottesville. It's called the Monroe Institute. It was founded by a fellow by the name of Robert Monroe, who began to spontaneously. He was a businessman who was basically an atheist, I guess, but he began to experience out-of-body experiences, and he actually founded an institute out there that studies out-of-body experience, and the University of Virginia is actually working with him to study this phenomenon. So anyway, there's a lot of people who are skeptical about this. For example, let's say if you take children who recall previous lives, they may out of 20 facts or whatever, they might get 19 right, but there'll be one wrong. So automatically, skeptics will say, well, there's something wrong with that. I think the thing that has to be understood about this type of research, though, is it's not like a scientist who replicates experiments and you can kind of snap your fingers every time you do the experiments, can come out exactly the same. The proof of this type of research is more like a lawyer that argues a case, right? So, if you're a lawyer who's going to put somebody in jail for 25 years or maybe worse, when you're arguing a case, you don't necessarily have somebody who's videotaped, right, and proved it, but there's enough evidence for a jury to determine, yes, this must have happened, right? Or is there enough? There's enough evidence there to confidently say that something exists. So that's a type of proof that is used in this case. And finally, what's the point of this? Well, again, the point is basically to support the concept that the elders talk about the reality of spirit. Okay, so it's interesting that if you can begin in terms of using like what you might call Western or secular methods of research to actually come up with something that appears to suggest that there is something beyond just what we experience through our five senses or whatever, that kind of answers the question which I'm sure a lot of you have asked. Where do we come from? Do we come from somewhere? Do we go somewhere after we die? That type of thing. And the answers that seem to be suggested by things like reincarnation and near-death experiences is that we do come from somewhere and we do go somewhere. Okay, still trying to hang on to my voice here. Okay, the other questions, of course, in universities there are a lot of skeptics, and I think there are a lot of skeptics especially in areas like science. And yet even in science itself, if you take a close look at it, those kind of that certainty, that you can know everything is kind of being broken down. And for example, in quantum physics, when you look at the subatomic level, the distinction between matter and energy disappears, right? So you all of a sudden have this. You're faced with this question. What really is matter? Is it matter or is it really energy? And of course we know now that through Einstein's E equals mc squared, that in essence matter is energy, right? It can be released into energy. And then there's interesting questions like, for example, what appears to be a fact that 95% of what exists is actually dark matter and dark energy, of which we know virtually nothing. And I like to also talk about Albert Einstein's major discoveries. For example, his discovery of the relationship between time and space, that time and space are related, that time and space can be warped. Also between mass and energy, the conversion between mass and energy. These major discoveries, it's interesting that these discoveries actually came through his imagination, or what elders would call revelation or meditation. And it said, for example, when Einstein discovered the connection between time and space, that when he was young, he used to daydream. He used to daydream that you could ride on a beam of light, and it was already known that that light there was already an understanding of the speed of light. And so one day, apparently, when he was sitting in his office, he was working apparently in a patent office in Germany, I believe it was, And he could see a clock out of his window. And so he started looking at that clock, and as he was daydreaming, he was visualizing himself moving on this light beam away from that clock. And he began to realize that as he moved away and reached the light of speed, that the hand on the clock was slowing down, and when he reached the speed of light, it actually stopped. So, all of a sudden he got that inspiration, that at the speed of light, time stops. So there's a connection there. And so once he got those revelations, the mathematics came later. I mean, people really didn't, believe him. Even things like the bending of light because of gravitation. That was something that it took years and years of experimentation to confirm. But guess what? He was absolutely right. The mathematics eventually was worked out. So as I know, one person said to me, he says, I know this one person was, because I know when I started doing some of this research, I started to think, well, people will think I'm crazy for looking at this stuff. But, this one person told me, he says, when you think of the last 200 years, it was interesting because he said, 200 years ago, he says, there are probably more people who believed in things like, for example, the reality of spirit than were secular, whereas today it's very much opposite, right? Most people are secular and very few believe in any kind of aspect of soul or spirit or whatever. But also pointed out that when you take a look at over the last 200 years of the amount of understanding that we've achieved just in terms of understanding the nature of our universe, for example, or understanding the nature of matter, who's to say that in the next 200 years we won't make further advances in terms of understanding, what is spirit, or if you want to call it consciousness or whatever. So, okay, so I'll wrap up with this little thing that I found on the internet, and it was just basically kind of looking at this whole question of how universities are so skeptical about spirituality, and I know that at one time, let me just read it here. Okay, so in a 2010 survey on graduate offerings on psychology and spirituality in 13 major universities in Canada by Dr. Chris Holmes of York University for 0 Point, which is an organization he set up, revealed that for, quote, an inquiring student who would like to learn something of mystical or spiritual psychologies or paranormal studies within the Canadian university system in modern psychology, the results are somewhat disheartening. As a matter of fact, another part of the report, he basically called it a wasteland. Canadian University as a wasteland for doing research on anything having to do with spirituality. Only one of 13 universities, and I put that in there. Guess which one? We can come to that later here. Offers any course offerings in this area, and there's not a single professor out of 429 in the survey having expertise or interest in psychology of the soul, consciousness or spirit, nor the interface between psychology, mysticism, and science. This is despite the overwhelming public interest in the significance of these areas and the fact that these enigmas of consciousness are the most significant issue of science in science today. So, which one do you think it is?
University of Virginia?
Nope. This is Canadian.
No.
Pardon?
No.
No, not for Nook, no.
Here?
Here, University of Regina. Remember I mentioned the transpersonal psychology courses? Now, my understanding is, and I've in the course of my research, I've had a chance to kind of chat with people like Paul Antrobus, who I'm not sure if he still teaches classes here, but he's well known for teaching what's called parapsychology, and I also know Dr. Bill Wynn, Buddy Wynn they call him, who actually started the parapsychology classes here, and also started the Warehouse Bookstore, if anyone's familiar with that. And they started out, there were actually 3 universities apparently who opened up their doors to this type of research. There was York University in Toronto, Simon Fraser University in BC, and the University of Regina. And as I talked to Paul Antrobus and Buddy Wynn, it became apparent that these people were eventually shuffled out the door because it was not considered to be a proper area of research. And so, he's basically saying, the University of Regina is the only bastion in the Canadian psychology establishment, right, that still actually has the audacity to, to do this stuff, right? So, I guess, one of the things that I say is that, the First Nations University is a place that should be doing this. I mean, it is part of our culture, right? The elders tell us this, and so this is something that I think we need to take seriously, and we need to incorporate in our research and our teaching.